The disappearance of Maura Murray begins on the cold evening of Monday, February 9th, 2004, in the small, quiet town of Haverhill, New Hampshire. Maura, a 21-year-old nursing student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, seemed to be living a relatively normal life. Yet beneath the surface, signs suggested she was struggling with personal challenges that may have contributed to her mysterious disappearance. In the days leading up to that fateful evening, Maura exhibited odd and concerning behavior. On February 7th, she had wrecked her father's car in a minor accident, leaving her shaken and possibly feeling vulnerable. On the day of her disappearance, she emailed her professors and work supervisors to say she was taking a week off due to a death in the family, a claim that turned out to be untrue. These actions suggested Maura was planning to leave for a short period, though her ultimate intentions remain unknown. That evening, Maura packed her car with clothing, textbooks, and a few personal items, including a printed email indicating relationship troubles with her boyfriend. She also withdrew $280 from her bank account, nearly emptying it. Around 7 p.m., she departed Amherst, heading north toward the White Mountains of New Hampshire, a region known for its isolation and rugged terrain. By 7:30 p.m., Maura had purchased alcohol at a liquor store, including a box of Francia wine, vodka, and Bailey's Irish Cream. Notably, there was no indication that anyone else was traveling with her. Her actions suggested a solo trip, but her destination and purpose remain a mystery. Approximately 2 hours later, Maura's black Saturn sedan crashed into a snowbank on Route 112, a winding rural road in Haverhill. The crash occurred near a property owned by Butch Atwood, a local school bus driver. Atwood later told police he offered to help Maura, who declined, stating she had already called for roadside assistance. This claim was false, as no calls to such services were ever logged. Atwood observed no visible injuries, and Maura's demeanor appeared calm. Shortly after, a passing motorist made a 911 call to report the accident. However, when police arrived at the scene less than 10 minutes later, Maura was gone. Her car remained where it had crashed, locked, with some of her belongings inside, including an open box of Francia wine and her damaged airbags. The police also noted a rag stuffed into the tailpipe of her car, a detail that has fueled endless speculation about whether Maura attempted to disable her vehicle intentionally. What followed was a massive search effort. Law enforcement and local volunteers scoured the immediate area, including the surrounding woods, fields, and rivers, but no trace of Maura was found. Search dogs followed her scent about 100 yards east of the crash site before losing it abruptly, leading to theories that she may have been picked up by a passing vehicle. The lack of physical evidence from that night created a void that would soon be filled by speculation. The questions began to pile up. Why was Maura driving to such an isolated area alone? Was she running away from her problems, or was she meeting someone? And most hauntingly, did she encounter foul play after leaving the crash site? This opening chapter in Maura Murray's case sets the stage for one of the most perplexing mysteries of the 21st century. As the search for answers began, the situation only grew more complex, drawing the attention of amateur sleuths, internet detectives, and true crime enthusiasts from around the world. What seemed like a straightforward missing person case quickly unraveled into a web of theories, missteps, and unanswered questions. The initial investigation into Maura Murray's disappearance was fraught with challenges and missteps that hindered efforts to uncover the truth. By the time authorities arrived at the crash site on February 9th, Maura had already vanished, leaving investigators with few clues to follow. In the critical early hours of the case, a lack of immediate action and coordination between law enforcement agencies may have cost precious time. When police examined Maura's car, they found several puzzling details. Her packed belongings, including textbooks and personal items, suggested she was planning to stay somewhere temporarily. However, There were no signs of struggle or foul play at the scene, and her wallet and identification were missing, implying she had taken them with her when she left. This added to the mystery, as it left open the question of whether she had walked away voluntarily or under duress. Maura's family, particularly her father, Fred Murray, expressed frustration with how the investigation unfolded in the early stages. Fred was vocal about what he saw as a lack of urgency and coordination. For instance, the search radius was initially limited, and while ground searches were conducted in the immediate area, it took days for more extensive efforts, such as canine units and aerial searches, to begin. The rag stuffed into the car's tailpipe, a detail noted by responding officers, sparked significant debate. Some speculated it was an attempt by Maura to disable her car intentionally, while others suggested it might have been a harmless act, misunderstood in hindsight. Regardless, this single piece of evidence became a focal point for internet sleuths and amateur detectives who questioned its potential significance. Early theories about Maura's disappearance began to take shape. The most widely discussed included the possibility of a random abduction, the idea that she might have wandered into the woods and succumbed to the elements, or even that she had staged her own disappearance. Each theory had its supporters and detractors, and all were complicated by the lack of physical evidence and eyewitness accounts. One notable early lead came from witness accounts. Local residents reported seeing a young woman matching Maura's description walking eastward along Route 112 shortly after the crash. However, this sighting was never confirmed, and search dogs traced her scent only a short distance before losing it completely, further complicating efforts to track her movements. Adding to the complexity were the contents of Maura's computer. Investigators discovered she had recently searched for directions to Burlington, Vermont, as well as articles related to accidents and disappearances. These searches suggested she may have been planning to leave the area and possibly escape her troubles, but they provided no definitive answers about her intentions or destination. As days turned into weeks, the investigation began to attract widespread attention. Media outlets picked up the story, and Maura's case became a national headline. However, this increased visibility also brought challenges. A flurry of tips and leads poured in, many of which were dead ends, and misinformation quickly spread, further complicating the search for truth. In the months following Maura's disappearance, online forums and communities dedicated to the case began to emerge. These platforms became hubs for discussion, with amateur sleuths analyzing every detail of the case, from the crash site to Maura's personal life. While these efforts kept her story alive, they also generated a barrage of unverified theories, many of which distracted from the core investigation. Despite the intense public interest and growing online scrutiny, Maura Murray's case remained frustratingly elusive. The lack of conclusive evidence, combined with early investigative missteps, left law enforcement with few solid leads. As the investigation stalled, the case seemed to be slipping further into the realm of speculation and mystery, leaving Maura's family and friends desperate for answers. The story was far from over, though, and as new theories emerged, so did deeper questions about what might have happened in the moments and hours after Maura vanished. As time passed, Maura Murray's disappearance began to take on a life of its own, with theories and speculation multiplying both within law enforcement and among amateur sleuths. Without definitive answers, the public latched onto any detail that could potentially shed light on what had happened that cold February night. Some of these theories were grounded in plausible evidence, while others ventured into the realm of the bizarre. One of the more contentious theories was the possibility that Maura had been picked up by a passerby. The stretch of Route 112 where she disappeared was a rural area with limited visibility at night, especially in winter conditions. Witnesses reported seeing a few cars passing through the area around the time of the crash, including a school bus driver who stopped to offer assistance. Maura reportedly declined help, saying she had already called for roadside assistance, though later investigation revealed no such call was made. This small but significant detail led some to believe she had been waiting for someone to pick her up, either intentionally or by chance. Speculation arose that she may have accepted a ride from an unknown driver who ultimately posed a threat. However, without concrete evidence, this theory remained speculative, with no verified sightings or leads to confirm it. Another avenue of investigation involved a series of reported sightings of a young woman resembling Maura in the days and weeks following her disappearance. One such report came from a convenience store clerk who claimed to have seen someone matching Maura's description in a vehicle with several men. Despite follow-ups on these leads, none of them led to definitive answers or confirmed sightings of Maura. Adding to the mystery was the strange discovery of a series of items found in nearby areas. Although none of these items could be conclusively linked to Maura, they fueled theories that she may have wandered off into the wilderness. Despite extensive searches involving helicopters, cadaver dogs, and volunteers, no physical trace of Maura, such as clothing, footprints, or remains, was ever found in the surrounding woods. The Ragged Mountain theory also gained traction as more details about the area surfaced. The remote and rugged terrain was known to be difficult to navigate, especially for someone unfamiliar with the area. Some theorized that Maura could have become lost, injured, or worse while trying to find shelter. The notion that she might have met with foul play in such a remote location also lingered in the minds of investigators and her family. Online sleuths dove into Maura's personal life, scrutinizing her relationships, her behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance, and even her mental state. They noted that Maura had withdrawn from classes at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, had emailed professors claiming a family emergency, and had packed her dorm room belongings before leaving campus. While some interpreted these actions as signs she intended to start over or escape her life, others saw them as routine or coincidental. Further complicating matters were cryptic clues about Maura's activities on the day she vanished. Surveillance footage from an ATM showed her withdrawing money just hours before the crash, appearing calm and composed. She had also purchased alcohol, which was later found partially consumed in her car. These details painted a picture of someone who seemed to be preparing for a short trip, though they left questions about her ultimate destination unanswered. The lack of communication from Maura after the crash deepened the mystery. Her cell phone was last used to check voicemail shortly before the accident, and there was no evidence of any calls or texts after she left the scene. Investigators were unable to determine if her phone had been turned off, destroyed, or left behind. As theories about abduction, voluntary disappearance, and accidental death swirled, the case became a cultural phenomenon. Podcasts, documentaries, and online forums dissected every piece of information available, and Maura's story became one of the most discussed mysteries in the true crime community. Yet despite the collective effort to unravel the truth, her disappearance remained as perplexing as ever. By now, the investigation had shifted from finding Maura alive to uncovering what could have caused her to vanish so completely. With no physical evidence, suspects, or clear motives, each theory added more layers to an already convoluted mystery, leaving her family and the public desperate for even the smallest breakthrough. In the years following Maura Murray's disappearance, her case has evolved into one of the most enigmatic mysteries of the 21st century. Despite the relentless efforts of her family, investigators, and an ever-growing community of online sleuths, the answers remain frustratingly out of reach. The enduring nature of this mystery has transformed Maura's case into a symbol of the complexities and heartbreak of missing person investigations. For Maura's family, the disappearance marked the beginning of a tireless quest for truth. Her father, Fred Murray, became the most vocal advocate for keeping the case alive. He conducted his own searches in the Haverhill area, personally combing through the dense woods and rugged terrain where Maura was last seen. Fred often criticized law enforcement for what he believed were missteps in the initial investigation, including delays in treating the case as a potential crime. Despite the passage of time, he continued to push for new searches and leads, determined to find answers no matter how elusive they seemed. The role of the public and media has also been a double-edged sword. On one hand, widespread attention kept Maura's story in the headlines, ensuring it wouldn't fade into obscurity like so many other missing person cases. Documentaries, podcasts, and even an episode of Disappeared brought new eyes to the investigation, occasionally leading to tips and renewed interest. However, this visibility also had its downsides. The intense scrutiny of Maura's personal life and the theorizing of online communities often bordered on invasive, with some speculating recklessly about her character and motivations. One persistent challenge has been the lack of any definitive physical evidence. Unlike cases where DNA, witness statements, or other tangible clues help piece together a timeline, Maura's disappearance exists almost entirely in a vacuum of uncertainty. Even modern advancements in forensic technology and search methods have failed to produce significant breakthroughs. Searches using ground-penetrating radar and aerial drones have yielded no results, further amplifying the frustration of investigators. A unique aspect of Maura's case is its ability to foster such polarizing opinions. Some firmly believe she fell victim to foul play, potentially at the hands of someone passing through the area. Others suggest she may have succumbed to the harsh New Hampshire elements after wandering into the wilderness. A smaller but vocal contingent holds on to the idea that Maura deliberately staged her disappearance, seeking a fresh start, far from her past life. Each theory carries its own weight, yet none can claim definitive proof. In recent years, renewed efforts to solve the case have continued. The Maura Murray Missing Persons Foundation, established by her family, works to keep the investigation active while supporting other families of missing persons. Law enforcement occasionally revisits the case, though the leads they pursue often prove inconclusive. In 2021, the New Hampshire State Police announced a new search in the area where Maura vanished, but once again, no definitive evidence emerged. The case has also left a profound impact on how missing person investigations are conducted. Many have pointed to the need for immediate action in such cases, better coordination between law enforcement agencies, and the use of advanced technologies like digital forensics and geospatial analysis. Maura's story serves as a sobering reminder of the challenges investigators face, especially when the trail runs cold in the critical early hours. For those closest to Maura, the uncertainty is perhaps the hardest part to endure. Without answers, her family and friends remain caught in a liminal space between hope and despair. They are left to grapple with the possibility that they may never know the truth about what happened to the vibrant young woman who vanished on that snowy February night. Maura Murray's disappearance has become more than just an unsolved mystery. It's a story that encapsulates the fragility of life, the resilience of those left behind, and the relentless pursuit of justice. It's a case that continues to defy explanation, leaving behind a haunting legacy of unanswered questions and the faintest glimmer of hope that, someday, the truth will finally come to light. As we close the chapter on Maura's story, it's clear her disappearance will remain a subject of fascination and debate for years to come. But for her loved ones, the search for resolution is far from over. In the end, the hope of finding Maura, whether in answers, justice, or peace, will continue to drive those who refuse to let her memory fade into obscurity. In the small town of Grafton, New Hampshire, the morning of May 20th, 1981 began like any other. But for Kimberly Morin, a 17-year-old high school senior, it would be the last time anyone would see her. Kimberly had plans for the day, like any teenager, but as the hours passed, something seemed off. She vanished without a trace, and her sudden disappearance quickly became a mystery that would haunt the community and her family for years to come. Kimberly had been living with her mother in Grafton when she disappeared. It was a quiet, close-knit community, and it was hard for people to understand how someone could simply vanish from their lives. That day, Kimberly was last seen leaving her home. Her mother, who was at work at the time, spoke to her on the phone and later reported that nothing seemed unusual. Kimberly had mentioned she was going out, but there was no sign of her afterward. As the day turned to night and Kimberly didn't return, concern began to grow. Her family and friends immediately became worried, fearing something was wrong. When it became clear that she hadn't come home by the evening, her mother called the authorities, reporting her missing. Law enforcement began investigating, and the search for Kimberly was on. The first days after Kimberly's disappearance were filled with uncertainty and fear. Volunteers and officers alike scoured the area, knocking on doors and questioning neighbors, hoping to find any clue that might help them figure out where Kimberly had gone. But despite their efforts, no evidence was found. There were no signs of a struggle, no sign of forced entry, and no obvious clues pointing to a crime. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Her case was made even more mysterious by the fact that there was no indication of foul play. There were no ransom notes, no signs of a violent altercation, and Kimberly's belongings remained at her home. The only thing missing was Kimberly herself. In the days following her disappearance, rumors and theories began to swirl around town, but no one could say for certain what had happened to her. As the investigation progressed, the local community rallied around the Morin family, offering support in any way they could. But as days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. The sense of unease grew, and the question everyone was left asking remained. Where was Kimberly? Had she run away, or had something sinister happened to her? The disappearance of Kimberly Morin was only the beginning of a long and difficult investigation that would uncover little in terms of answers. For now, all anyone could do was wait and hope that some clue, however small, might lead to the truth about what really happened to Kimberly Morin. As the days passed without any sign of Kimberly Morin, the search for her intensified. Law enforcement agencies, volunteers, and community members worked around the clock, combing the area for any trace of the missing teenager. The local authorities, initially hoping for a quick resolution, found themselves facing a growing mystery with no leads to follow. Despite their best efforts, every road they explored seemed to lead to a dead end. Within the first week, the New Hampshire State Police took over the investigation, eager to uncover any details that could explain what happened to Kimberly. A missing persons report was filed, and detectives began interviewing anyone who might have had contact with her. They questioned family members, friends, and acquaintances, but no one could provide any significant information. There were no clues, no witnesses, and no obvious reason for Kimberly's disappearance. The community, which had once been a tight-knit and peaceful place, now became a place of fear and suspicion. Neighbors watched each other more closely, and everyone seemed to be asking the same question. Who would take Kimberly, and why? With the lack of leads, it became clear that Kimberly's disappearance was no simple case of a runaway teenager, as some had initially feared. As the investigation expanded, the authorities focused on the area around Kimberly's home. They searched wooded areas, fields, and nearby roads, hoping to find something, anything, that could give them a clue as to where she had gone. The terrain was challenging, but they were determined to leave no stone unturned. In addition to the physical search, the authorities also looked into Kimberly's background, hoping to uncover any details that might explain her sudden disappearance. They learned that Kimberly had no history of running away and had been a reliable student. There were no signs of trouble in her life that could suggest she had intentionally vanished. Meanwhile, the family was growing increasingly desperate for answers. Kimberly's mother, who had been living in a constant state of worry, organized her own search efforts, enlisting the help of friends and local volunteers. Despite their determination, they faced an overwhelming sense of frustration. Each day without news of Kimberly felt like an eternity, and with each passing day, the hope of finding her seemed to fade. As weeks passed, the media coverage of the case began to die down. Once a prominent story, it was becoming less of a focal point for news outlets. The Morin family felt the weight of this decline as they continued to fight for attention on their daughter's case. Despite the dwindling media coverage, they remained hopeful, never giving up on the possibility of finding their beloved Kimberly. The investigation also led to a few theories. Some speculated that Kimberly might have been abducted by someone she knew, while others believed she could have met with an unfortunate accident. With no clear evidence pointing in any one direction, the authorities continued to pursue every lead, no matter how small. However, as the months passed, the mystery deepened. There was still no trace of Kimberly, and the sense of unease continued to grow. What had happened to her? Why had she disappeared without a trace? With no concrete answers, the investigation into Kimberly Morin's disappearance became more challenging as the search for clues continued, with no success. As the case stretched on, it became evident that this would be no ordinary missing persons case. As the search for Kimberly Morin continued, the months following her disappearance saw occasional developments, but none of them provided the breakthrough everyone had hoped for. Investigators, growing more frustrated by the lack of new evidence, were forced to reconsider every angle. Despite their best efforts, they could not uncover any significant new information that could explain her sudden vanishing. In the summer of 1981, a glimmer of hope emerged when a witness came forward with a potential sighting of a young woman who matched Kimberly's description. A local resident reported seeing a girl in a park near Grafton, roughly 2 weeks after Kimberly disappeared. The witness described the girl as appearing nervous and anxious, which led them to believe it could have been Kimberly. The police immediately pursued this lead, believing that it might provide the key to unraveling the mystery. However, by the time the authorities arrived at the park, the girl had already vanished. The witness could not confirm with certainty that it was Kimberly, and no other information came to light from the incident. This sighting, while promising, ultimately led to another dead end. The brief hope that had surged through the community was quickly dashed as investigators realized that the person in the park was not Kimberly, or was too far from the description to confirm it was her. Despite the lack of tangible progress, the authorities continued to follow every tip that came their way. They conducted additional interviews with people who might have had knowledge of Kimberly's whereabouts or had seen her before her disappearance. Over time, it became clear that many of the people interviewed had little to offer, and the few new leads that did arise were too vague to be pursued effectively. The frustration within the investigation grew as the case stagnated. As each new lead failed to provide answers, the pressure mounted on investigators to find something concrete. The community, too, began to feel the weight of the uncertainty. Friends and family members of Kimberly were constantly in touch with the authorities, hoping that any new information would provide the closure they desperately needed. But as months turned into years, it became more apparent that the case was not going to be solved quickly. Authorities began to look into the possibility that Kimberly might have been the victim of foul play. With no sign of her in the surrounding area, no ransom demands, and no obvious signs of an abduction, the idea of a stranger taking her seemed unlikely. They also explored the possibility that Kimberly had run away, though this theory seemed out of character for the teenager, who had no history of leaving home without informing anyone. With the investigation stagnating, the authorities turned their attention to reviewing old evidence and re-examining the case with fresh eyes. They revisited Kimberly's background, hoping to uncover new details that might have been overlooked. They also sought to explore any connections between Kimberly and potential suspects who may have been involved in her disappearance. Yet, despite their efforts, the case remained unsolved. As time went on, the Morin family's pain and frustration continued to grow. Despite their hopes, the mystery of Kimberly's disappearance seemed to be slipping further away with each passing year. The uncertainty that surrounded the case was taking its toll on everyone involved, leaving them to wonder if the answers they sought would ever come to light. The disappearance of Kimberly Morin became a cold case that lingered in the minds of those who had been close to her, but without any new developments, it seemed like the truth might remain hidden forever. Still, the investigation continued, as law enforcement held on to a glimmer of hope that one day they would uncover what happened to the young woman who had disappeared without a trace. As the years passed, the case of Kimberly Morin's disappearance remained unsolved, becoming one of New Hampshire's most perplexing cold cases. The search efforts slowed, but Kimberly's family and a handful of dedicated law enforcement officers refused to let the case fade into obscurity. They continued to hold on to hope, even as the years turned into decades. While the case was not actively pursued by investigators, it was never officially closed. By the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, the advancements in forensic technology offered new possibilities. Law enforcement agencies began to revisit old cases using new techniques, and the Morin family kept pressing for answers. Kimberly's disappearance was included in the list of cold cases that were reviewed with fresh eyes. Despite these renewed efforts, there was still no concrete evidence that could explain where Kimberly had gone or why she had disappeared. Over the years, the Morin family worked tirelessly to keep Kimberly's story in the public eye. They participated in missing persons events, reached out to the media, and spoke at community gatherings, hoping to spark new interest in the case. Their efforts were not in vain. In the late 1990s, the story of Kimberly's disappearance resurfaced in the local press, drawing attention once again to the mystery. This resurgence of interest brought forward new theories and speculation, but no new facts were revealed that could solve the case. Some people believed that Kimberly had run away, though her family maintained that this was highly unlikely. Kimberly had no history of leaving home without notice, and those who knew her well insisted she would not have left her family and friends behind. Others considered the possibility of foul play, but without evidence, it remained a theory rather than a fact. One of the most significant moments in the investigation came in the early 2000s, when Kimberly's case was added to the list of unsolved cases under the jurisdiction of the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit. This step renewed public interest in the case and brought in more attention from investigative bodies. However, despite this new push, investigators still struggled with the lack of physical evidence, clues, or leads that could definitively answer the question, what happened to Kimberly? Although the case of Kimberly Morin remained unresolved, her family never gave up. They continued to fight for answers, attending rallies for missing persons, and advocating for greater attention to cold cases like Kimberly's. With each passing year, the hope of finding her dwindled slightly, but the family's determination remained steadfast. Kimberly's mother, in particular, expressed her desire to see justice for her daughter, no matter how much time had passed. The emotional toll on the Morin family was immense, but they kept Kimberly's memory alive in hopes that someday someone would come forward with information that would bring her home. As the decades passed, the case became part of local folklore, a haunting reminder of how a young woman could disappear without a trace. While the community had moved on in many ways, the mystery remained unsolved, continuing to spark questions and intrigue among those who remembered Kimberly and her story. The disappearance of Kimberly Morin was far from forgotten. Many people in Grafton and beyond still wondered what happened to the teenager who seemed to vanish from the face of the earth. Though the passage of time made it increasingly difficult to uncover new leads, the Morin family refused to give up hope. They remained determined to find out what had happened to Kimberly, even if the answers seemed impossibly distant. As time continued to march forward, the case remained one of New Hampshire's most enduring mysteries, leaving the question unanswered: what really happened to Kimberly Morin? Despite the passing of decades, the disappearance of Kimberly Morin in 1981 has never been forgotten. Her case remains one of New Hampshire's most enduring unsolved mysteries, and it continues to haunt those who were closest to her. Kimberly's family, friends, and the local community are still left with more questions than answers, wondering what happened to the teenager who disappeared without a trace. Over the years, many theories have surfaced, ranging from the possibility of an abduction to the belief that Kimberly ran away. Yet, with no physical evidence supporting any of these theories, the case has remained frustratingly unsolved. Investigators have revisited the case multiple times, even as recent as the 2000s, but no new developments have surfaced that can definitively explain her disappearance. While many cold cases are eventually solved through new technological advancements or fresh evidence, Kimberly's case has proven to be an exception, continuing to resist any clear resolution. Kimberly's family, though weary from the years of uncertainty, has never stopped searching for answers. They've continued to advocate for the case, attending missing persons rallies, and pushing for the case to remain open, hoping that someone, somewhere, might come forward with new information. Their resilience has been a testament to their love for Kimberly, but with each passing year, it becomes harder to keep the hope of finding her alive. While there have been no new significant breakthroughs, the memory of Kimberly's disappearance is still alive. Her story continues to serve as a reminder of how mysterious disappearances can have a lasting impact on families and communities. It highlights the importance of never giving up, no matter how much time passes. For the Morin family, the search for Kimberly is far from over. They refuse to let the case slip into obscurity, no matter how long it has been since that fateful day in May of 1981. Kimberly's case also speaks to the larger issue of missing persons and the challenges that law enforcement faces when dealing with cases where there are no clear leads. Even with advancements in forensic technology, some cases remain impossibly difficult to solve. It is a sobering reality for families of missing persons who must cope with the uncertainty of never knowing what truly happened to their loved ones. As we look back on the case of Kimberly Morin, we are reminded that not all mysteries are solved quickly, and some may never have a clear resolution. The disappearance of Kimberly, with no answers and no closure, stands as a testament to the complexities of criminal investigations and the lasting emotional toll on those left behind. The search for Kimberly continues, and the hope that someday someone will come forward with the truth persists. For now, the case remains open, but the mystery endures. And for Kimberly's family and the community, the question still lingers. What happened to Kimberly Morin, and will the truth ever be uncovered? Until that day comes, the story of Kimberly's disappearance remains one of New Hampshire's greatest unresolved mysteries. Beatrice Trask's life in the 1950s seemed to follow the typical path of a middle-class woman in New England. But behind the closed doors of her home, there were layers of complexity that few could see. In the years leading up to 1956, Beatrice faced a struggle between wanting to break free from the expectations of society and the pressure to conform to them. Born in a small town, she was expected to follow the conventional roles of wife and mother. But Beatrice had dreams and desires that went far beyond these expectations. She was not content with the life society had planned for her. Her early years were filled with the same pressures many women of her time faced. But as Beatrice grew older, she started to feel suffocated by the roles she was expected to play. She married young, as was customary for women of her age, and moved into a traditional family life. However, her marriage was far from happy. She found herself trapped in a controlling relationship, one where her husband made all the decisions and her own desires were constantly suppressed. Beatrice's struggles with her marriage were not the only challenges in her life. She had always been drawn to art and creativity, interests that set her apart from her peers. As a young woman, she sought freedom in artistic expression and found herself dissatisfied with the mundane expectations placed upon her. Her marriage, while not abusive in a traditional sense, left her feeling alone and confined. She began to retreat inwardly, grappling with her growing resentment toward her husband and the life she felt forced into. During this time, Beatrice had a deep internal conflict. She was torn between wanting to be the dutiful wife and mother society expected and wanting to pursue a different path, one of freedom and independence. This struggle, in many ways, defined her character and her life up until her disappearance. It wasn't just her marriage that weighed on her. It was the expectations of the world around her that left her feeling trapped, unable to break free. But in the spring of 1956, everything changed. On the evening of May 20th, Beatrice Trask was found murdered in her home in Exeter, New Hampshire. Her life, which had been full of internal battles and a longing for something more, came to a tragic and shocking end. No one could have predicted how the events of that night would unfold. And as the investigation began, it became clear that Beatrice's story was much more complicated than anyone had imagined. The mystery of her death would reveal that the person she had become, a woman conflicted between societal expectations and personal desires, was central to understanding the tragedy that had befallen her. The details of her murder were shrouded in mystery, and investigators quickly realized that this was not a typical crime. There were no signs of a break-in, and little evidence suggested that a robbery had taken place. The house where Beatrice was found had been locked from the inside, leaving authorities puzzled and desperate for answers. How could someone be murdered in such a secure home with no clear motive? This opened up a web of possibilities. Was Beatrice's death the result of an argument gone wrong? Or was there something darker at play? Her life had been filled with struggles, but did it also hold a deeper secret? As the investigation moved forward, one thing became clear. Beatrice's murder was not a simple crime. There were many layers to peel back, and many questions that would remain unanswered for years to come. After Beatrice Trask's body was discovered on May 20th, 1956, the investigation into her death began with a sense of urgency. Authorities in Exeter, New Hampshire, were shocked by the brutal nature of the crime. The town was small, quiet, and known for its tight-knit community, so the murder of a local woman in such a secluded area felt both personal and terrifying. Detective James Holbrook, assigned to the case, wasted no time in attempting to unravel the mystery of what had occurred that fateful evening. The house where Beatrice was found was situated on a quiet street, and neighbors had not heard anything unusual in the hours leading up to the discovery. This made the case even more puzzling. There were no signs of forced entry, and the scene appeared to have been meticulously staged. Whoever had been responsible for Beatrice's death was clearly someone who knew how to cover their tracks, and that only made the investigation more complex. The first step in the investigation was to look into Beatrice's personal life. Detectives started with her husband, whom Beatrice had been married to for nearly 10 years. They had been known to have a strained relationship, often seen arguing, though their disagreements were nothing out of the ordinary for couples in that time. But in the weeks leading up to her death, Beatrice had grown more withdrawn, and rumors swirled that she might have been involved in an affair. This was a possible lead that police quickly explored. At first, Beatrice's husband was the most obvious suspect. He was home at the time of the murder, but claimed to have been out in the yard doing some yard work. His alibi seemed shaky, and investigators couldn't rule him out as a suspect. Neighbors mentioned hearing raised voices earlier in the evening, though they couldn't say for sure whether it was Beatrice and her husband. The couple's strained marriage was well known, and many wondered if that tension had finally boiled over into violence. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Beatrice had a complicated web of relationships. Apart from her husband, there were whispers about a possible affair with a local man, but there was no concrete evidence to support this claim. Theories began to emerge that Beatrice's murder was the result of jealousy or revenge, but no one could prove who might have been driven to such extremes. In the days following the discovery of Beatrice's body, detectives interviewed friends and family members, hoping to uncover more clues about her life. One friend recalled how Beatrice had become increasingly anxious in the months before her death, frequently talking about feeling trapped and unfulfilled in her marriage. She had also mentioned wanting to leave Exeter and start over elsewhere, but she had never followed through. This revelation seemed to indicate that Beatrice was searching for a way out of her circumstances, but no one knew if she had actually made plans to escape. There were no signs that Beatrice had been in a violent struggle. Instead, investigators noted the lack of defensive wounds, suggesting that she had been caught off guard, or that the killer had been someone she trusted. Her calm demeanor in the face of her death added another layer of mystery to the case, leaving investigators to question whether she had known her killer, or if there had been some sort of tragic confrontation that escalated unexpectedly. As weeks passed, the case became colder, and the lack of solid leads left investigators frustrated. Theories ranged from a crime of passion to to a random act of violence, but without physical evidence, all these possibilities remained unproven. The death of Beatrice Trask had shaken the town, but it seemed that the answers would be far harder to uncover than anyone had hoped. Despite the police's efforts, the investigation seemed to stall, and as the months went on, the case began to drift to the back of people's minds. But for those who knew Beatrice, and for those who were still searching for answers, the haunting question of who was responsible for her death lingered. As the investigation into Beatrice Trask's murder continued into the summer of 1956, new leads began to surface. Detectives had initially concentrated on her personal life, focusing on her marriage and potential extramarital affairs. But as the weeks passed and the case grew colder, they expanded their search for answers. One lead came when a local resident, Robert Miller, came forward with a peculiar piece of information. Miller, a neighbor, claimed to have seen a man standing near Beatrice's house on the night of her death. This man was described as a tall, dark-haired figure, seemingly out of place in the area. The sighting was vague, but it offered a new direction for the investigation. Miller couldn't identify the man or recall much more about the encounter, but it was enough to encourage police to start looking at individuals in the area who might fit the description. Around the same time, another neighbor, Mary Green, reported that she had seen a car parked near the edge of Beatrice's driveway around the time of the murder. The car was an older model, possibly a sedan, and it appeared to be waiting in the shadows. This new testimony added to the growing mystery, as it suggested someone may have been lying in wait before Beatrice was found dead. However, the car's make, model, and color remained elusive, and no license plate number could be identified, which made it hard for investigators to follow up. In parallel with these new testimonies, the police decided to delve deeper into Beatrice's professional life. They learned that she had worked for a short period at a local art gallery, where she had formed a connection with some of the artists and patrons. Though she was not directly involved in any significant financial transactions or dealings that might have led to her death, her work at the gallery did introduce her to a new social circle. Investigators began questioning those who frequented the gallery, hoping to uncover any hidden tensions or motives that could have played a role in her death. Interestingly, during these interviews, several people mentioned that Beatrice had been increasingly withdrawn and anxious in the months leading up to her death. This supported the earlier accounts from friends and family, suggesting that her anxiety had been growing, though no one could pinpoint a specific cause. It became clear that while Beatrice had maintained a degree of mystery, she had also been showing signs of distress. However, no one could explain exactly what she had been afraid of, nor could anyone offer concrete evidence to suggest who might have been involved. Despite these new lines of inquiry, the case still lacked the breakthrough evidence it needed. Detective James Holbrook and his team had their hands full, sifting through contradictory witness accounts and piecing together a timeline that was anything but clear. The more the investigators looked into Beatrice's life, the more complex the case became. Every new lead seemed to raise more questions than answers, and the community was growing restless. Around mid-June, investigators began to theorize that Beatrice's death might not have been as spontaneous as they initially thought. In fact, some of the evidence suggested that it could have been a premeditated crime. The meticulous staging of the scene and the lack of a struggle suggested that the killer might have been someone who was familiar with the victim's habits and surroundings. It was also possible that Beatrice's killer had known about her fears, perhaps even using them to manipulate her into a situation where she felt she had no choice but to comply. Though these theories began to form, the case continued to frustrate the investigators. The lack of physical evidence, combined with the contradictory witness statements, left them unable to pursue any single lead with certainty. Beatrice's family, meanwhile, struggled to cope with the loss of a woman they had never fully understood, but whom they mourned deeply. For them, the idea of never knowing what truly happened to her was almost as devastating as the loss itself. As the investigation moved into its second month, the focus began to shift from specific individuals to the larger, more abstract question: why would someone want to kill Beatrice Trask? The answer to that question remained elusive, and the case began to feel like an unsolvable puzzle, one that, despite all the efforts of the police, might never be pieced together. As the investigation into Beatrice Trask's murder stretched into the summer of 1956, the mystery only deepened. Despite the various leads that had emerged, investigators were no closer to understanding why Beatrice had been killed, or who had been responsible for her death. The lack of clear evidence was frustrating, and as more time passed, the case began to feel like a series of dead ends. Detectives re-examined Beatrice's relationships, this time focusing on her connection with a man named Thomas Edwards, a local businessman who had been a regular visitor at the art gallery where Beatrice had worked. According to several sources, Beatrice and Thomas had become close friends during the brief period that she had been employed there. Thomas, a wealthy and charming man, had been seen with Beatrice at various social events, and there were rumors that their relationship was more than just friendly. However, there was no concrete evidence to support the idea that their relationship had turned romantic, or that it had played a role in her death. Despite this, Thomas Edwards became one of the key individuals in the investigation. Detectives interviewed him several times, but his responses were always consistent, and there was no evidence to suggest he had been involved in Beatrice's murder. Edwards claimed that he had not seen Beatrice for several weeks prior to her death, and he had an alibi for the night of the murder. Though his alibi was never fully confirmed, investigators found no reason to believe that he had been involved in any criminal activity. As the investigation dragged on, the focus shifted back to Beatrice's personal life, particularly her emotional state in the weeks leading up to her death. While many witnesses reported that Beatrice had been withdrawn and anxious, no one could provide a clear explanation for why she had been feeling this way. A breakthrough came when a former close friend of Beatrice's, Judith Rogers, came forward with a startling revelation. Judith claimed that Beatrice had confided in her about an ongoing dispute with a woman named Laura Simmons, who had been a fellow art lover and a frequent visitor to the gallery. According to Judith, Beatrice had been deeply troubled by this woman's behavior and had confided in her that Laura had been making threats. Beatrice had expressed fear that Laura might harm her, though it wasn't clear what had led her to feel this way. This new information brought Laura Simmons into the spotlight. Investigators learned that Laura had been a known troublemaker in the local art community. She had a reputation for being overly competitive and had been involved in several public disputes with other artists, although there had been no direct evidence linking Laura to Beatrice's death. The idea that there had been a personal conflict between the two women gave investigators a new line of inquiry to pursue. The search for evidence regarding Laura Simmons proved difficult, as she had no known criminal record and had not been linked to any violent incidents. However, as investigators dug deeper into Laura's background, they found that she had been under financial stress. Laura had recently been involved in a bitter legal dispute over a piece of artwork that she had been accused of stealing. This added a layer of complexity to the investigation, as it suggested that Laura might have been desperate and could have had a motive to harm Beatrice. Despite these developments, detectives continued to struggle with the lack of concrete evidence. The case had become more tangled than ever, with new theories emerging, but no clear resolution in sight. As the summer of 1956 turned to fall, it became apparent that the truth behind Beatrice Trask's murder might remain elusive, leaving both her family and the community searching for answers. The investigation had uncovered several intriguing leads, but without the key piece of evidence, investigators found themselves in a difficult position, with no clear path forward. The public's interest in the case waned over time. For those who knew Beatrice, the search for justice remained just as urgent as ever. As the mystery of her death lingered in the minds of those closest to her, it became increasingly clear that the answers, if they existed, were buried deeper than anyone had imagined. As autumn of 1956 settled in, the investigation into the murder of Beatrice Trask began to lose momentum. Despite the tireless efforts of the police, there was still no breakthrough, and the case gradually slipped into obscurity. With no solid evidence or clear suspects, the mystery surrounding Beatrice's death remained unsolved. In the years that followed, rumors and speculation continued to swirl in the small community where Beatrice had lived and worked. The theories about who was responsible for her death and why ranged from jealousy and betrayal to a personal vendetta, but none of them could be proven. Beatrice's case became one of those haunting stories that never seems to fade away, leaving more questions than answers. The lack of closure for her family and friends only deepened the tragedy. It wasn't until the early 1960s, almost a decade later, that the investigation was formally closed by the police. Without new leads or evidence, they declared the case unsolved, marking the official end to the search for answers. However, for those who remembered Beatrice, the impact of her death lingered far longer than the official conclusion of the case. The investigation's failure to uncover the truth about Beatrice's murder left an indelible mark on the community. It wasn't just the tragic loss of a woman with so much potential, but the sense that something dark had occurred that remained hidden in the shadows. Many wondered if the answers had always been just out of reach, or if the case had been mishandled from the start. For Beatrice's family, particularly her parents, the years without closure were a constant source of pain. They had hoped for justice, for the truth to come to light, but that hope slowly turned into grief. Beatrice's death was not only a personal loss, but also a symbol of the unanswered questions that continue to haunt many unsolved murders. The painful reality of an unresolved case is that it becomes a wound that never fully heals. For her loved ones, there was no peace, no understanding, and no closure. Even though the years passed, the mystery of Beatrice Trask's murder never entirely faded from the minds of those who had known her. It remained a tragic chapter in the history of the town, a story of a woman who never got the chance to fulfill her dreams, and a community left to wonder who could have been responsible for her untimely death. The absence of answers served as a reminder of the limits of justice and the frustrations that come with trying to unravel the complexities of human nature. Ultimately, Beatrice Trask's story is a reflection of the harsh realities of life in a time when women were often expected to live within strict boundaries, and personal struggles could easily be overlooked. Her death was the result of a series of complicated events, relationships, and emotions, but the ultimate cause of her demise was left shrouded in uncertainty. Today, Beatrice Trask's murder remains one of those cold cases that never quite goes away. The passage of time hasn't made it any easier for those who still remember her. The questions surrounding her death still echo through the years, and while the investigation may be officially closed, for those who are closest to her, the haunting mystery lives on. Her story, like so many others, serves as a reminder of the stories that are left untold and the mysteries that continue to linger in the darkest corners of history. While Beatrice may never have found justice, her memory lives on in the minds of those who continue to seek the answers to the questions that remain unanswered.